jump right into it to say it's a great opportunity to share the space with you today as we close off Women's Month, which is of course a commemoration of the very powerful, very assertive women that have brought the democracy that we enjoy in South Africa today. And to commemorate that today, I'm going to talk about women who work in conservation, but also that aren't directly employed in conservation, but play a very significant role, even though often they are invisibilized in that important role that they play. So to start off, I'll just give you a brief outline to give you a sense what I'm going to talk about, and then we will jump right into it. So first, I'm going to give you a sense where my work comes from, right? Like the introduction mentioned, my work has been interested in how property and labor relations intertwine, especially in private conservation spaces in South Africa. But of course, that's too big for today, so I'm going to narrow it down to focus specifically on labor in conservation, especially the role of women in conservation. So to nest the work and to give you a sense of where some of my propositions and my arguments come from, I will first begin by outlining the what we call the conservation mode of production, and just to give you a sense of what we mean by when we say conservation is a mode of production, what do we mean by that? And then I'll go into a question about social reproduction, which is a theoretical concept that has been central in my own work. And lastly, we'll dive into a discussion of social reproduction in labor, especially, or rather the social reproduction of labor in private nature reserves. So just to give you a brief sense of what we mean by the conservation mode of production, and I think it's important to go through this so that we sort of understand how I came to the question of labor. Give me a second, I have to change my view here. There we go, much better. Right, so when we talk about the conservation mode of production here, it's where critical scholars have analyzed conservation as a mode of production. And here they argue that there's an inclination of conservation, and we'll talk about what kind of conservation I'm talking about here in a little while. But essentially, conservation has this inclination to transform the value of nature into capital, right? So here you have a seemingly omnipresent capitalist mode of production more broadly, which some of us have heard about. And scholars are arguing that short of being set apart from that, conservation is also part and parcel in creating value, in creating commodities. And as a result of this, is part of the broader capitalist mode of production. And this was seminal in its approach, because here scholars were arguing that we can't just view conservation as hunky-dory, as doing good for broader wildlife and society, but really nesting conservation within our capitalist mode of production. And that fundamentally shifts our thinking and our understanding of what conservation does, what kind of value it produces. And here, just to give you a little teaser of what they mean, Garland here suggests that wildlife conservation be conceived as a particular kind of capitalist production, one which lays claim to the intrinsic or natural capital game animals represent, augments this value through various mediations, and ultimately transform it into capital of a more convertible and globally ramifying kind. And again, here Garland suggesting that we can't see conservation outside of our broader political economy. And in fact, to understand it deeply is to nest it within understanding, how value is produced, how labor is subsumed, how property is organized in that space. And similarly, Kelly here argues that there's a link between Marx's concept of primitive accumulation and exclusionary conservation practices, such as the creation of protected areas, which enclose land and exclude resident populations. And lastly, Busher and Fletcher suggesting that, we can think about, conservation as another form of accumulation. So broadly, what these works are suggesting, like I mentioned, is that we can't see conservation as set apart from our broader political economy, as its conservation is essentially value producing as well. Now, there are many actors and organizations that are implicated within this conservationist mode of production. And they include NGOs, whose work often involves putting a literal price tag on different types of natures, including wildlife. This includes nature reserves, which are spaces for both consumptive and non-consumptive products as well, including hunting or ecotourism. And of course, we have private anti-poaching units who are employed to continue to continue or to enable the continued capital accumulation within conservation spaces, and payment for ecosystem services, which I won't get into, but essentially a whole host of organizations, services, processes that are integral in packaging natures with a capital S there, different forms of nature to produce or to create commodities, which are then sold. And these types of commodities can either be consumptive or non-consumptive as well. So this is sort of where the background of my work is coming from. This is just to say, we again cannot see conservation as set apart from understanding our broader political economy. In the same way we understand mining as value producing, in the same way we understand the garment industry as value producing. Scholars here are saying that conservation, in the same vein, is value producing, is accumulating capital in various forms. But of course, this is all good and well, right? Because now, we have located conservation, and in particular, private nature reserves in the broader capitalist mode of production. But of course, if we're going to argue that conservation is a mode of production, we have to ask yourself, who is producing, the commodities? Who is doing the labor? Who is creating the surplus value? And that brings into question an integral issue, which is the question of labor, which is going to be the discussion for today. Sorry about that. And to sort of, it is important to sort of understand how labor is produced in conservation spaces, because this also allows us to sort of zoom out of these geographical spaces, right? Often when we analyze conservation, there's a tendency to look at the private nature reserve as a nucleus, the state-owned reserve as a nucleus, the community-based management area as a nucleus. But by looking at labor here allows us to sort of have an expansive analysis of the geographies within which these areas are located. So by looking at labor, we start looking at, riparian community. We start understanding, the communities that live next to these conservation landscapes as well. And to dig into the question of labor, here I borrow from feminist political economist Fraser, who argues that Marx's account of capitalist production only makes sense when we start to fill in its background conditions of possibility. So here Fraser was saying it's not good enough just to say, well, she wasn't talking about conservation, but we can infer that, it's not good enough just to say conservation is a mode of production, but what are the background conditions of possibility that make conservation possible? What are some of the, the nitty-gritty, messy things that are happening, behind the conservation mode of production that allow value to be produced in conservation? And that's where sort of my entry point is into the labor question, to say there's a lot of, labor practices, labor regimes that enable conservation commodities to be produced, that enable conservation spaces to be maintained, and what do those labor practices and labor regimes look like? I won't get into this, but if you're interested in some of this work, it's encapsulated in these books, but this is where sort of my inspiration has been coming from to understand social reproduction in conservation landscapes. Now, a brief history of social reproduction. So social reproduction as a concept emerged out of a concern with theories of value that privileged paid work while invisibilizing unpaid work. So there was this concern that, in understanding our broader political economy, there's been this tendency to focus exclusively on paid work practices. So what's happening in the factory floor, what's happening in the office, what's happening on the plantation. So those are the kind of activities that were often analyzed when we're thinking about labor, and oftentimes invisibilizing the unpaid work. So at the time, the concern was that much theorizations about the economy were production orientated, like I mentioned, looking mainly at the plantation or at the factory floor, while also ignoring and downplaying the unpaid work, the care labor, and the myriad so-called unproductive activities and practices that contribute to societies, right? And here they're arguing that there's an intertwined relationship between paid labor and the unpaid work of daily life. So what's happening in communities, what's happening in the home front is very essential for understanding labor practices, the paid activities that are happening as well. So an integral question that we can ask, is what constitutes as work? And here Bauhart asks rhetorically, is the construction and trade of weapons more productive for the economy than the bearing and raising of children? And we know that the classic answer would be, to see these productive activities as more important, whereas bearing and raising children, feminist political ecologists would argue, is also very much integral in understanding our political economy. So again, feminist political ecologists insist that capitalism is a socio-economic system. It's not just an economic system, it's a socio-economic system, and that wage work is also very essential to understanding unwaged activities. And they challenge the understanding of paid work as productive and unpaid work as unproductive. And we can think about our own homes as well, right? If your mom is a stay-at-home mom, she's seen as unproductive, and yet she's doing particular forms of labor that allow you as a child, as a husband, as a son, or whatever relation you have. Those activities are very integral for your own survival, right? And yet often these activities that happen in communities, in the household, are seen as unproductive, whereas activities that happen in the formal economy, including, again, the plantation, the factory floor, the offices, those are often seen as productive. So feminist political ecologists fundamentally challenge this notion. Furthermore, social reproduction examines the interaction of paid labor and unpaid work in the maintenance of bodies and societies. It is fundamentally gendered, it is racialized, and is very classed as well. And if we think about the South African context very explicitly, most of you will probably have a helper, a domestic worker who is Black, whether you're a Black middle class person or a white person. That is the gendered work of social reproduction, that often gendered, racialized, classed bodies often do these care activities such as, cleaning, such as taking care of children as well. So really, social reproduction is about understanding the mutual interdependence between productive sphere and reproduction sphere as well. So here it shows that the so-called reproductive spheres of nature and female work are in fact the ground for the so-called productive sphere, that without all those activities that are happening at home, that all those activities that are happening in the community, workers would not be able to show up for work. And that's a fundamentally simple but transformative idea of understanding how value is produced as well. That again, we cannot divorce what's happening in the paid or in the formal economy from what's happening in our homes and activities, our homes and communities rather. So here Cindy Katz suggests that social reproduction is the fleshy, messy, and intermediate stuff of everyday life. It is also a set of structured practices that unfold in the dialectical relation with production, with which it is mutually constitutive and intention. Again, simply put, that we cannot divorce these two spaces from each other, the productive sphere and the reproductive sphere as well. So there are three main components of social reproduction that we can think about. And the first, the most simple, the most basic, is biological reproduction. Who does most of the, well, all of the caring of children is women, right? That's a direct social reproduction. That's reproducing laborers, right? It's women that reproduce workers for the next, generation of workers. The second component also speaks to our education. Some of you will be in university, some in technicons, and here is the reproduction of the labor force. It's our education systems that are geared, for better or for worse, to reproduce forms of labor differentiation as well. Some of them gendered, some of them classed as well. And thirdly, it's about the social processes connecting to caring and socialization. And here is all this, what Cindy Katz said, it's all the fleshy, messy stuff that's happening in the household as well. So I won't get into this, but this is just to say we can analyze social reproduction from various scales. And this is just to say, again, these scales are interdependent. We can't divorce what's happening at the micro scale, what's happening in communities, from what's happening globally. So a classic example would be the 30 by 30, which will have direct implications. You know, that's a sort of a global discussion, right? But it will have direct implications for livelihoods on the ground. It will have direct implications for access to land. And that's fundamentally a question of social reproduction. So just to sum this bit up, here is just to say, essentially what feminist scholars are advancing with social reproduction is the notion that workers' ability to perform at their best and hence maximize the production of surplus value relies heavily on the unpaid work of women. So for all of us in the space, for us to be able to show up in this platform, to be able to be sitting here, there's probably a mom, there's probably a grandmother, an auntie back home taking care of children. So all of us are enabled by these unpaid activities, right? And also that only interpretations of social reproduction activities and realms as value producing can advance our understanding of labor relations of contemporary capitalism. And again, only when we can really come to terms or come to grips with what's happening both in the formal economy, but also at home as well, can we more fully understand how value is produced. So at this point, you're probably thinking, oh my God, Lerato, social reproduction, interesting, but what does this have to do with the conservation of biodiversity? And this is where I'm going to talk about all the gogos and the mamas who are in villages who enable conservation spaces to flourish. So just a note on methodology, this work is based on a long ethnography that I did in the Lowveld for about 18 months. And during that time, I volunteered with an anti-poaching unit. I spent time in the National Archive of South Africa in Pretoria, which if you're a student, please go visit it. It's dark and gloomy, but very important in terms of documenting our history. And I also did live histories and interviews with conservation laborers, their families, and in the broader community as well. So like I mentioned, maybe I have a pointer here. So this is a pointer, yeah. So the work is based in the Lowveld of South Africa. So that's sandwiched between the Little Drakensberg Mountains and the Kruger National Park as well, and also work that I'm now doing in the Mapungubwe area as well. Now to zoom into the Lowveld, what we have here is the Kruger National Park on the far east, and you have in light green all the private nature reserves with a plethora of villages just south of that. And I come from a geography background, and the first question that you want to ask is, oh my God, how did this landscape become like this? How come you have conservation on one end of the spectrum, and then you have all these communities living here? And this speaks directly to the history of South Africa, which I don't have time to get into right now. And this is just a sort of a Google screen grab of the same region. Here you have the Orpen Road going into Kruger, and here you have all those communities living here. And most of this will be home of conservation laborers that I talk to and their families. And here in the sort of green, dense area, you have where the private nature reserves are as well. Now, to give you a bit of sense of what the socioeconomic contexts are in this space. In Aikenhoek, which is in the broader Bushbuckridge municipality, where the conservation laborers come from, you have, flush toilets of, only 2.6% of the community there has flush toilets versus 86.2% in the area where the private nature reserves are located. That's shocking, even in South African terms, I think. In addition to that, in the Bushbuckridge area, where you have where it is home to conservation labor, there's 52% unemployment versus 39% in the area where the private nature reserves are. And I can pull out many other stats that just fundamentally demonstrate the socioeconomic differences between where conservation labor live, where their homes are, versus where they work as well. And to give you a little sense of this, I want to tell you a story of Lily, who is a conservation laborer. Lily comes from Aikenhook, in a village that has chronic water shortages, as shown in this picture. And every day, Lily will wake up around 4 a.m. to get ready for work. She will make her children's lunch, and she will get herself in the bus around 6 a.m. Now she will jump on the bus, and then around 7 a.m., she's at the private nature reserve gate. Now, in order to make it to her work, Lily will start walking for 2 kilometers in a territory with mammals and predators on foot just to make it to her workspace. After work, after a long, exhausting day of mending the fence, of taking care of the animal pens, of doing all the conservation labor, Lily will jump back on her, well, she'll walk the 2 kilometers again in wildlife territory, jump on the bus, and then get back home where she left her mother to take care of her children. Now, Lily is one of the lucky conservation laborers that I spoke to. Many others didn't have moms living in the area, and so had to pay from their mere salaries other women to take care of their children while they're at work. Now, the story of Lily is not unique. It fundamentally represents the kind of social reproductive activities that women that work in conservation have to experience. Now, just to give you a little teaser trailer of the kind of working conditions that conservation laborers experience in South Africa. If you're not Lily doing a daily commute, you're probably living on the reserve for 21 days away from your family. You probably live in a very small room, sometimes shared with other people. The housing conditions that I have seen in some of the pristine conservation landscapes were just inhumane, deplorable. Oftentimes, conservation laborers in these positions are low skilled and are not paid well. And of course, this comes the added danger of working with predators when you're not armed mending a fence. The transport costs were simply exorbitant versus the kind of money that they were making. And this was compounded by the fact that the Labor Department is often apathetic and doesn't respond to concerns. And there was a deeply gendered and racialized division of labor as well. Often the housekeepers in the ecotourism lodge were Black women. The maintenance sort of low skilled jobs were Black men. The managers were often white, and this is very endemic to broader South Africa, not conservation as well. But this is just to say conservation is also just a microcosm of what the broader politics of the country that we live in. But here, what is really concerning is that often these conservation spaces will argue that, this is a unique African wildlife facility focusing on conservation and sustainability of rare, vulnerable, and threatened species. And yet the very people that work in these spaces to maintain these spaces are not taken care of at all. So to zoom into the social reproduction of conservation labor, first is the role of the social welfare state. South Africa has one of the best welfare states on the continent. So a lot of conservation laborers just depend on government grants, child grant, pension grant to augment their very poor salaries. In addition to that, many were involved in many subsistence activities, including farming, fishing, livestock, and often these activities were seconded to family members when the conservation laborer was at work. So you often had aunties, brothers, or anybody else in the community taking care of all the reproductive activities while the laborer is at work, again, demonstrating that we cannot divorce what's happening at home to what's happening in conservation landscapes. And of course, care work was often provided by wives, in-laws, grandparents when the conservation laborer is away for 21 days in the private nature reserves, and the added challenge of dealing with traumatized rangers as a result of the increased poaching that we've seen in the past couple of years. To further cement the social, reproductive activities that happen, I grabbed some quotes from conservation laborers that I spoke to over the years. And the first one suggesting that when I am at work, my mother takes care of children. Again, not unique to this laborer, but sort of endemic across the whole landscape where there was a deep dependency on the unpaid moms and grandmothers to take care of the home front while the laborer is at work. And again, one anti-poaching personnel suggesting that we also fear for our lives because if they don't get you, referring to poachers, they will come for your family and harass them. again, demonstrating that what happens in the workspace cannot be divorced, the kind of social, the messy, the fleshy, messy stuff that's happening at home as well. Conservation laborers, especially those in anti-poaching, often documented harassment from communities to their families, especially when they were in the reserve as well. And one here saying that my wife takes care of children when I'm here for 21 days. And we have a vegetable garden to supplement our sustenance because, again, workers are just not earning enough to maintain themselves based on their salaries alone. And lastly, one worker saying that when I get home, and this was a female worker, as you can imagine, I still have to do the washing, check homework, make dinner, and all these other activities, demonstrating that just because women are now employed or can work in the formal economy, they now have a double burden of both doing the social reproductive activities in the home front, but also in the productive sphere of work as well. So here I want to say that all these labor conditions that I've spoken about, all the unpaid work that's happening in communities, we cannot divorce them from all the conservation commodities that we see. So that a tourist can sit at the back of a tour car, and behold the beautiful African sunset. All those experiences of hunting, all those consumptive and non-consumptive activities of conservation are enabled by these very unremunerated activities, but also the abhorrent living conditions of workers as well. The picture on the right is that of conservation laborers living in a private nature reserve. And these conditions, again, I argue that they cannot be divorced from the pristine African sunset that a tourist will tweet online or share on their Instagram page as well. And to further underscore this, I point to sort of the protests that we've seen increasingly in South Africa, across the whole country, of course, but also around conservation spaces, here again demonstrating that all the shortcomings, all the challenges that people experience in their reproductive sphere will have an implication for the productive sphere for conservation. So increasingly, we've seen protests blocking the open road. Oh my God, every other day there's a protest blocking the open road. People, protesting against service delivery. And these are spaces where conservation laborers come from, where they don't have consistent access to clean, drinkable water. And here, this is where I want to argue that these types of conditions, again, cannot be divorced from our understanding of how value is produced in conservation. And lastly, during my work, I often asked conservation laborers, what are the 3 most pressing challenges that you can think of? And all of them often mentioned water was the first one, bad roads, especially in the Bushbuckridge area, and also unemployment, where youth unemployment in the region is 64%. None of the conservation laborers ever mentioned rhino poaching. And that's not to say that they don't care about rhinos, but their reproductive sphere, there were just so many challenges happening in their reproductive sphere that, their immediate needs were just not being met. They were not being able to reproduce themselves sufficiently in order to show up to work sufficiently actively the next day as well. So just to sum all of this up is to say all the activities that Lily's mom and many others embark on in the reproductive sphere, in the home, in the communities. These activities are central in understanding how conservation commodities are produced. So here we call for an urgent need for transformative change within the conservation sector to recognize some of these invisibilized laborers that are labor activities that are happening in our homes as well. And this is where my current project takes me, where we're trying to understand how better to create just conservation landscapes in South Africa, paying cognizant also to the unemployed, unpaid, unremunerated activities that are happening in our homes as well. So that is it from me.
Lerato, thank you so much for sharing light on such a difficult topic and opening our eyes to something like that. I think we know it, but the reality doesn't really hit us like what you just showed us now. So I don't know, what can we do to change things, is there anything that we can do as students, researchers, people in the workforce to make a difference?
Yeah, I should have anticipated this question because I get it a lot, but
Yeah.
every time it always comes as a surprise because I don't have the giant disclaimer, I don't have a silver bullet for what can be done, but I can think about some really transformative structural changes that are needed, especially when we think about conservation in South Africa, which is, one of our, especially in rural landscape, a big land user in the area. So there are broad implications there for livelihoods as well. And a very uncomfortable question, but there is need for transformative change. There's need for sharing a bit more in South Africa. There's need to redistribute land, uncomfortable as it is, but there is a need for transformative change. And in terms of sort of the everyday labor, so that's on the more structural end of the spectrum where society more broadly outside of conservation needs to transform. But at a more everyday level, I think just employers need to treat their workers better. There needs to be dignity in the workplace, and that's deeply lacking within some of the most pristine conservation landscapes. But as to what a student can do, for me, is to ask the hard questions. Where do you tour when you go on holiday in the Lowveld? Do you recognize the laborers? Often not, because their compounds are behind a hill because they're so ugly that tourists shouldn't be seeing that. So I think for students, the first thing is to ask the difficult questions and to research these questions. So that's a tangible, doesn't necessarily change society overnight, but that's where I think change can start.
Yeah, it might start with each and everyone doing something. If each individual does something, in that way, if you help your neighbor, everyone gets help.
Yeah, and to start demanding, better living conditions for workers and only visit those that uphold a decent, living wage and decent accommodation in these spaces.
I was curious about something. So, I mean, everybody's got their own COVID story. Like I went to my hometown in Kimberley during that time, and then I got stuck there for 3 months because I couldn't cross borders. Do you know any stories of what happened to these workers during that time? Did anyone get stuck and away from their family for long periods of time?
Yeah, so a couple of workers that I spoke to were actually let off because some of these areas depend heavily on international tourists. So when the borders were closed, there wasn't lots of tourists coming in, and that had a significant impact on just the bottom line of the conservation area. So many of them were let go, but increasingly we're seeing many also going back into the workspace as well.
Yeah, because I was thinking they, just as you spoke now, they are the essential workers.
Yeah, but often not recognized as such if you look at
Not
how
recognized as such. Yeah. I see. It's not a question, but I'm going to read you a statement by Mina Buthelezi.
Mhm.
It's very informative and a true reflection of what's happening in some of South Africa's rural areas. I'm from the lowland and I've studied nature conservation because I am a woman and I have all these social reproduction, social responsibilities. It is very difficult to get employed. I even relocated to the city because there are better schools for the kids, but really no conservation for me, or it's just difficult to get employed in a conservation field. Is there anything I can also say, as a female in this field, there's along the way as you're going, there are there are issues. The ceiling, we're on our way to breaking it. We've broke some parts of it, but not all of it. I worked at a fisheries once, and even once you qualified for everything, as a female now, you have to make a decision whether you're willing to get on a boat, with a bunch of males for 40 days or not. There's so many things in addition to the studies that we do and the research that we do that we need to focus. And I think that is a part, that is where we all have to work together in this. We have to work together, each and everyone as an individual, to make a difference.
Yeah,
Because no one can work on its own. I think on like you said in the beginning, on the different scales, it's going to be on gender scales for gender equality, but it's also going to be on the class scales and the business hierarchy.
Yeah, and I think what I really enjoy about, or what I find instructive with unpacking social reproductive activities is also to demonstrate that just because women have space or can work freely without limitation to a degree in the formal economy, that also that has come with a double burden. Like Mina has mentioned there, just because you're working doesn't mean all the other reproductive activities happening in home are less. If anything, there are more, because now you're doing two works, one paid, the other one unpaid. And I think female rangers experience this quite extensively as well, and often not valued in the same way as their male counterparts are seen, and often very sexist remarks that are made in that space as well. So quite some of these gendered racialized relations are still very endemic within these spaces.
And it's, I might be wrong, but it's very unwritten. You know, it's not written. It's just systematic or something. It's just taken and accepted in that way. Can I just read from Murphy to everyone? Hi, everyone. This is a unique presentation, probably the most unique presentation I've ever seen. Since most of the labor are unskilled and uneducated to some extent, I think we should include more scientists and educated people into labor forces in conservation. Imagine the same people have to conserve, but if they don't understand it from an educational point of view, it is mostly not sustainable. I'm sure the same scenarios might be happening even in Botswana. We just have to include transparency so that each organization allows people to see how they operate uncensored. Thank you for shedding the light on how women do double cause. I think at some point we should include it in policies that a working woman should be paid a gender-based scarce skill. That's a good point.
Yeah, I'm not sure what Murphy is suggesting there. So are you suggesting that more scientists be employed in conservation? Maybe I'm
Murphy, may I unmute you if you don't mind? Or Maret?
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Yeah. So Dr. Lerato, what I was saying there is that maybe to help solve some of the problems that you have highlighted there, especially how there might be unfairness in treating the workforce. Maybe if you include people who are more educated, scientists or any other educated people into the way the labor force, it might help include people who have light into know how things should be done, or what fairness could be. And also in terms of conservation, I mean, someone who is not trained how to see conservation in their own eyes, they might have problem conserving when no one is looking. So they conserve only when they have guests there, but when they are there on their own away, they might even not consider conserving because they see it as something that doesn't benefit them that much. So maybe by including more labor force that has scientists into those conservations, people who are educated into those conservations, they can also see that even the treatment, maybe to some extent, it's not a good one. I'm not sure if I might explain it better.
Yeah, thanks, Murphy. But yeah, I think just to probe you a bit further there, I think the assumption there would be that scientists also inherently, or natural scientists rather, that they have an inherent interest in seeing workers treated well. I mean, some of these landscapes have budding research units looking at all forms of flora and fauna, and yet they still have the same labor conditions. And yeah, I think with a 65% unemployment rate in some of these communities, it would also be difficult to justify employing scientists in low-skilled jobs.
Mm-hmm. I also think, Murphy, from your voice, I'm guessing you're a guy that's speaking. I'm just making an assumption, but I think it's a guy. And I think it's a good thing, because I think what he's saying is that those of us that have managed or have gotten the opportunity to get where we are today, to be scientists and to have the knowledge that we learned as conservationists, I think we almost need to turn around now and help those that didn't have the opportunity, I think, and bring them forward and share the information that we've learned with them for the next step to happen. I think that's the implication. Murphy? And I think that, yes, there's all these females that is watching here today, including us, but it's also we're the males, which is why I'm saying I'm glad that Murphy's a male, that needs to turn around now and lead once the qualifications are through.
Oh, okay. Yes, I'm a guy. I'm actually a PhD student also in natural resources management. I've been to conservation facilities, private reserves and stuff. So what the doctor there is saying, Dr. Lerato is saying, I actually understand and I can relate. One thing that you explained better that I was trying to explain is that by this, the reserve might hire, let's say, cheap labor because they want to profit from that. But then what ends up happening is that you get someone who's scared to even voice out because they just want to be, they don't know, like the mind is not developed to know that I can stand up to this. So by probably including one or two educated person to a certain level here and there, it will help the facilities probably lower how they treat people there and improve how they treat people there. So that's one thing that I've seen and thought maybe it might help. But I hear that also that with the unemployment rate, it will be unfair to now put more educated people there and when there are no uneducated people. So then we can come back to the part where now we try and say, let's make the production uncensored. Whatever the facilities do, let's do it in such a way that it's uncensored. If someone, let's say a reporter, says, I want to see how you operate, and they come that same day, then they can be given full access to the facility and see how everything is to the workers and how probably their skills and everything adds up and helps the facility to operate. Because otherwise, if things are still censored to some extent, we won't even have a way to help to try and correct things. But if you can point out people's mistakes and try and correct them, then it's easier to help.
Yeah. I hear what you're saying, Murphy. I think it highlights a lot of things. It highlights inequality, and it also highlights the need for, or the reason why there's so much emphasis on, I want to say biodiversity, but diversity, just diversity in the workplace. So people from different backgrounds can share what they know. I mean, you don't know what you don't know. There's so much theoretical knowledge, so you don't know what you don't know. And so if there's diversity, I think that's where the importance of diversity in the workplace comes, that you can see from all areas and different points of view. I'm going to ask another question that's in the chat, and this one is from Johan, who hopes this is not an unfair question. He wants to know, can consumers or tourists rely on green and fair trade certifications as an indication of dignified conditions of staff and communities?
So I think though we need to rethink how we do conservation in South Africa as well, because it has been shown not to work so efficiently, especially when international tourism cannot continue.
Thank you, Lerato.
My question is, I'm also a PhD student and I really love your research. I'm grateful that you've shared this presentation. I was wondering, because I'm also looking at power dynamics in conservation spaces in Kenya, especially human-elephant conflict. And I have encountered conservationists who, when I'm asking questions about, like if I highlight that the conservation space has been created out of a history of inequalities and just oppression of the local communities. And I think because the community has this historical, it's like an emotion they've carried of a long time, that they know that not valued compared to elephants especially. And I've been told so many times that the conservationists are there to take care of the wildlife and preserve biodiversity, and not to engage in like trying to rectify the social inequality and transform the system. I was just wondering, from your experience so far, as because your research and your work is challenging the norm and the status quo of these conservationists who always seem to hold like a position of power, how have you navigated these questions when because you're challenging the status quo and they're benefiting from it, but then you're also asking them to somehow go beyond what they think is their main goal in conservation, that's taking care of the wildlife. How do you engage them in that conversation? And I think
thank you. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, and I think the last question
No,
is
go ahead.
how have you managed to operationalize the outputs of your research so that there's some kind of change in the institutions and the conservation organizations you're working with?
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you, Maureen. How have I navigated the challenges of working with conservationists who are intent on conserving wildlife and ignoring the broader socioeconomic context within which they work in? Sometimes I'm ignored. That's just comes with, and in the South African context, I'm a Black woman. Often I'm seen as working for the government Department of Land, and then it raises a couple of hairs, then people become uncomfortable, as you can imagine. So sometimes I'm just simply ignored. But what I have done, and this maybe speaks to the second question as well, at the end of my towards the end of my PhD, I went back to the Lowveld to sort of do an information sharing session with the conservationists there. And many also recognized these labor conditions and didn't ignore them, whereas others were just also questioning the science itself, right? And often, I'm sure you've encountered this yourself, that the social sciences is often questioned, like we're not seen as a science. So then you have to go into a discussion of why our empirics also matter, why speaking to, 80, women working in conservation is also robust data. But I think that also detracts from just the kind of political work that we do. So now, like, I don't try and justify my science. I do the work that I think is important, and I know it has legitimacy as well. And I think, one of the challenges that maybe conservation has is that people go into conservation as ecologists. So you studied, the phenomenology of the elephant, you studied the horn, and then people go into conservation. But conservation is also about people and nature. It's about our interrelations with people. So ecologists aren't inherently conservationists in the same way social scientists aren't inherently conservationists in that sense. So I think there's a need to really broaden an understanding of our ecological landscapes, to recognize that the phenomenology of elephants also has social implications as well. I hope that speaks to some of the questions that you have raised, Maureen.
But Maureen, while we're still there, I think also specifically with elephants, and specifically not just the phenomenology, like if we look at the behavior, let's look at the behavior and the way that's a female-led group. And I mean, they do the birthing. I think something that we can learn from them, or the matriarchs from them, is there's the saying that it says it takes a village. And last night when I was researching, I was just looking for pictures of the cavemen. And even they're picking up now that in the past, it was not necessarily that the caveman went out and the cave woman stayed at home and cooked. That actually it was villagers raising the kids. And the saying does go that it takes a village to raise the kids. So there might be a benefit to that.
Yeah.
I know in some cultures, it's where so it would be the grandparents, the parents, and the child. And so the grandparents would take care of the child. And then when that child has children, then that grandparents now take care. And I know that's how the structure works, and it seems to work. I can't remember. I don't want to say what I because it's going to be a guess. But I know in some cultures it works like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it shouldn't be a given. That's the issue here. Yeah. It shouldn't be a given, and it shouldn't be just a given that the women are going to, that this is extra on the extra, not a burden, but an extra responsibility of the woman alone.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's the issue at hand. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I think they're asking, so how can we ensure that all of these women, it does not matter if they are cleaners, inner lodge, general workers, or field rangers, how do we ensure that they are recognized and paid fairly? I think again that this is also just a question beyond conservation as well, because not only, you know, the invisibilized conservation laborers are unpaid, but more broadly, women in different spaces are unpaid. And what I think would be very interesting, and I think this is a conversation that's happening in South Africa now, is the issue of the living wage, a more, what is it called? Yeah, a broad-based living wage, so where it doesn't matter what sector you're working in, but just a living wage for everybody to be able to sustain themselves. But again, the way I see change is that there are fundamental structural changes that need to happen in our country, and the more slow, immediate things that can be done. And I think a living wage is the slow, immediate change that can be institutionalized, but that does not remove from the more structural changes that are needed to make our society a bit more equal.
I think that's also part of what Murphy was saying, is that, you know, you get a different type of wisdom. You get the wisdom from society. Okay, that's intrinsic, but because of the way everything is structured in today's world, you need a piece of paper to show what you've learned. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're more educated, but you do need that piece of paper. That's a different kind of wisdom that comes with it. And with a piece of paper, which is the degrees, the diplomas, all of that, you have more opportunities that comes with it. And I think that is what Murphy was saying, is that the ones that do get a chance to have that piece of paper and the opportunities further should actually play their part in further.
Yeah.
It should be a means. I think I'm right, Murphy. It should be a way to move forward, but at the same time, remember that you're not only doing it as a job in the sense. This is not always going to be a 9-to-5 job where you get a wage and then you go home to your family, actually. You know, it's going to be something where you need to keep in mind that you need to help society as a whole. Okay, now I was just saying thank you very much, Lerato, once again. Okay.
Pleasure.
Okay. Thank you everybody for joining. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you on the next talk.